We're here. I teased this in a community post and people seem pretty on board with the idea, but the next set of I Want to Talk About videos is going to be kind of a specific set of them. It's going to be like a series within a series, because I had this idea for a little bit and I thought it would be fun to make a set of videos out of it. Some of you probably saw my I Want to Talk About video on my favorite games of 2023, and I thought it would be fun to go back to previous years to talk about my favorite games from other eras. And originally I was just going to work backwards, start at 2022, and then just go back from there. But I thought I would start as far back at the beginning as I could. Again, as someone who loves gaming history, I thought, why not? And even though I figured that some of the earlier years would be a lot shorter and the videos wouldn't have as much to talk about, I still felt it was important to preserve some of these older games and the older history of games. In my mind, it didn't make sense to forget about where we started and to recognize some old games that I really enjoyed. That, and also as someone who tends to have a fear of forgetting things and of just the concept of being forgotten in general, I didn't want to forget the history. So pardon if this video is short, and pardon if I'm kind of scrunching all of this into one video instead of doing separate videos on different years of this era. As we get into the 2000s and the 2010s, of course, those videos will become individual years, but for the 80s and the 90s, we're gonna kind of combine things together a little bit. But enough yapping, let's get cracking. Welcome back to I Want to Talk About, the series where I take a topic, I sit on camera, and I blabber about it. And it's the first in this set of videos that I've been thinking about and planning for a long time, and we're finally here. So today, as you can tell from the title, I want to talk about my favorite video games of the 1980s. And I know when I mentioned the history of video games, I could have started at the 1970s from like the ground zero of gaming, but what would I talk about? Pong? Space Invaders? Zork? So I thought I'd start back at the 80s, because even that's going a bit far for me, because, I mean, look at me. Do I look like I was born in the 80s? If you say yes, I will come to your house and steal all of your food. So we're starting with the 1980s, and as far as how this video is going to work, if you saw my video on my favorite games of 2023, you should kind of know. But to give you an idea, I will basically take whatever year or era that I'm talking about, kind of introduce it a little bit, talk about what the landscape of gaming looked like at the time, any big major noteworthy events of that given year, and then I will get into the games that I enjoyed the most. Depending on how long I expect the videos to be and how many games I'm going to be talking about, I may also spend some time in these videos bringing up some noteworthy games that I didn't play, some just missed the cut type games. To explain that a little bit, as you may remember from that 2023 video, there are technically two separate lists when I talk about my favorite games in a given year. The first of them being the cream before the crop. Every game that I gave an 8 or 9 out of 10 to, before we get into the proper best list with the games that I gave a 10 out of 10 to. So depending on how long the videos are, I might go into some of these 7 out of 10s to let you know what just missed the cut. Again, it will come down to what the games I didn't play and what the games I gave a 7 out of 10 were, just if there are noteworthy games to discuss in either topic. Also of note, I will be basing games in this series off of their US release dates. I know that there are a lot of games throughout the history of gaming that came out in Japan first, or maybe Europe first, but I'm from the US, so I'm going off of what would be my calendar. So I know, for example, some people might bring this game up when talking about my favorite games of the 80s. Some of you might say, where's a game like Super Mario Bros. 3? That will be in a later video because it came out in America technically in 1990. I think it was on the Play Choice 10 in the 1980s, but I'm counting the NES version, which came out in 1990. So just bear that in mind. Just wanted to get that out of the way. So the 1980s. I wanted to make this all one video in the entire decade because I would not have had nearly enough to talk about if I made 10 separate videos about my favorite games of 1980, 1981, 1982, blah blah blah. Hell, there's not really many games on this current list that I'm going to give you guys, hence why there's been so much time on the intro. This video is really just a feeler to get you guys kind of prepared, help you understand what you're getting into, and then once we get to separate years like the 2000s or the 2010s, for example, those videos will be substantially longer. If you remember, my 2023 video was about 40-something minutes, so yeah, they'll get longer. This one is kind of just a feeler. So the 1980s, a time when gaming was kind of first starting to become a commercial product, a time I wasn't alive for, of course, but again, I have learned as much as I could about the gaming history of that time, an era that was initially dominated by arcades as well as the Atari, but also an era that saw one of the biggest downturns that gaming has ever seen with the video game market crash in North America, which came as the result of several different factors. A lot of people blame it on the E.T. video game. It wasn't just E.T.'s fault. Hell, I could go into a full discussion about how the E.T. game is not actually one of the worst games ever created like some people say it is, but that's a topic for another day. Rather, it was a combination of lackluster software along with the fact that so many consoles were coming out that were just complete copycats. The market was becoming really overstuffed, and suddenly gaming at a point seemed like a fad. That might seem like really wild to hear about now because gaming is such a popular, profitable medium. I believe gaming revenue might at times have been even higher than that of like film or music or other art forms. And obviously with the rise of things like competitive gaming, that's even more money in the scene. So you might not think it now, but yeah, there was a time where video gaming seemed like it was just a fad. And many were worried that it was going to become a fad. That is, until Nintendo came along in 1985 with the NES and really revived the US gaming market. Sure, the gaming markets were fine in Japan and Europe and other countries and things like that. Gaming was alive and well in Japan, but here in America, it didn't seem like it was going to be that way. But along comes the NES and some other big games, and suddenly gaming was back in vogue, and we started to see the first little bits of the gaming landscape as we would come to see it later on. Now, again, there aren't going to be as many games on this list as other lists, not because I haven't played a lot of 80s games. I mean, as much as playing some of these older games is basically staring into the petri dish of gaming, I have at least tried to play a few, but again, my knowledge and interest in 80s games doesn't spread quite as far as my interest in games across other decades, so I know some of you will watch a list like this and wonder, where are things like Castlevania, Metroid, Mega Man, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, Street Fighter, games like that, like these iconic early 80s games? Trust me that at least a few of these series will show up in later lists, but they won't necessarily show up here. And I guess it's worth pointing out that in some of these cases, some of these classic games have gotten remakes over the years, so I played them in those forms and we'll discuss them then. So yeah, again, I've mentioned a couple times this video is going to be short, but now we'll start getting onto the lists. As I said, pretty much for me to talk in depth about a game in any of these videos, it would have to be a game that on my personal scale I would see as at least an 8 out of 10. Because to me, an 8 out of 10 is a game that I consider great, as is a 9 of course, and a 10 is obviously one of my personal favorites. I give a lot more 10s than most people would think, by the way. But because this video is short, and because these are a couple notable games, I will mention some games that just missed the cut. That's what I'd consider this section, the just missed the cut section of games that I gave a 7 out of 10 to, that might have just missed that barrier for entry of being great games. And the two I have here, both might be slightly hot takes, but the first of them I would say would be the Super Mario Bros. Lost Levels game, which is a fun and extremely challenging take on 2D Mario, but the game was essentially just an expansion to the first game, so it wasn't really anything that crazy. And maybe a little bit of a hot take, but another game that I personally gave a 7 out of 10 to that just missed the cut was the original Legend of Zelda. And that's not out of disrespect for what this game did, because this game laid the groundwork for a lot of gaming's biggest adventure titles to come, and even playing the game myself, I was able to look at it and say, wow, I can see how this thing it did or that thing it did is still being explored and done in this game and that game and that game. I mean, pretty much if you are an action game, an adventure game, an RPG game, anything like that, chances are you were directly or indirectly inspired by Zelda, because if you weren't directly inspired by the original Zelda, you were inspired by something that was. So its influence is still clear today. It's just, for me, as someone who is A, not crazy into 2D Zelda, and B, not playing it with a 1980 whatever mindset, there are some areas where I feel like it's aged a little bit, and it doesn't feel quite as fun today for me as some other entries in the series, which we'll get into in later videos. But it's still a game I think is worth playing for the historical impact on its own. Again, playing this game is like staring into the petri dish of action, adventure, RPG game history in a big way. So I feel like it's one of those games that even if I wouldn't call it like a 10 out of 10, one of my favorite games ever, it's one of the most important games ever made, and one that I think everyone kind of owes it to themselves to at least try out. With that said, I apologize in advance to anyone who absolutely loves the game and was expecting to see me give it a 10 out of 10. But now we'll get into those cream before the crop games, the games that weren't quite 10 out of 10s, but I still loved them quite a bit, games that I would have given an 8 or 9 to. None of these games I've actually given proper number ratings to. So that's the weird thing, but I'll just talk about them all the same because I love them all the same. There's only 3 here, 3. A couple of them I kind of combined 2 different versions together because it'll make sense when I bring them up. But these games are classics. All the games that I mentioned are going to be games that you probably have played many times and probably also love yourself. And they are some of the most iconic games of the 1980s, starting, of course, with Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man. Everyone knows Pac-Man, an arcade classic, a maze game that whenever I see it, I'll stop whatever I'm doing to play it. If I'm out in any public setting near an arcade and I see a Pac-Man machine, I'm making a beeline to the Pac-Man machine. This is a game I really love because it's such a simple formula, but it just never gets old. It's easy to see why it's had the history and impact and influence that it's had, because despite it having such a simple formula, it's just so addicting. And there's plenty of challenge and fun to be had with it as well. I combined Pac-Man with Miss Pac-Man because I feel like I actually kind of enjoy Miss Pac-Man a little bit more, just because from what I remember playing of it, it's a bit faster and more unique than the original game, with a lot of clever new ideas too. But I'd be happy with either. Like I said, if I'm in an arcade and I see some kind of Pac-Man machine, I'm making a beeline to it. It's one of the most iconic games ever created for a reason, and it's still incredibly fun. Namco obviously ruled the 80s, and Pac-Man wasn't the only game that I absolutely loved back then, though, because Rally X and New Rally X are another set of arcade racing games that I had a lot of fun with. It's like they took the maze-like design of Pac-Man and said, what if cars and what if speed? It's just so fun and fast-paced, and the looping music track is really damn catchy too. Doom 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 doom. Actually, New Rally X's theme song is even catchier to me. Much like with Pac-Man, I actually enjoy New Rally X even better for its improvements to the overall gameplay and changes that give it a little bit of a fresh flavor compared to the original. I have a close friend, I could actually say who it is because you might remember him if you remember the Freedom Fighters Gaming Let's Play channel that I had. But Dave from the Freedom Fighters channel and from Wayside Gaming has one of the Namco Museum PS1 discs, and it has New Rally X on it. And whenever we pull the game out, New Rally X is one of the games I look forward to playing the most. There's something so charming about it, and again, I really feel like Namco back in the 80s really nailed something as far as these games that were like really simple but also really challenging. And New Rally X happened to be my favorite of the bunch, probably. All respect to Pac-Man, I love me some Rally X and New Rally X. And last on the cream before the crop, I can't not bring this game up. Growing up now and gaining more of an appreciation for puzzle games as I've become a young adult has helped me realize and understand just how frickin' awesome Tetris is. This game has some of the most addictive gameplay that you'll ever find in a video game, point blank period. And it's a formula that stands the test of time. Fun fact, while I was kind of writing out the script for this video and getting some things planned out and doing all that, I actually took a quick break to play Tetris, and I almost thought I'd never actually get to filming afterwards because I just didn't want to stop. It's easy to get into, tough to master, and even tougher to not get addicted to. There's a reason that it's pretty much the most iconic puzzle game ever created because, I mean, if you play it once, it's going to be hard to ever want to put it down. It's still truly a fantastic game, and even its oldest versions are just as fun. But despite all of these games being so fantastic, there is one 1980s game that I have not brought up yet that is definitely a 10 out of 10. It's my favorite game of the 80s and one of my all-time favorite games. One of the most iconic games ever created. I brought this series up earlier, and I'm sure you guys were just waiting for me to bring it up again, knowing how much I absolutely love this series. Of course, my favorite game of the 1980s is Rygar. What? No. What did I write in the script? I didn't actually write Rygar in the script. I just wanted to bring up Rygar. I've never actually even played Rygar. I just wanted to say the name Rygar because it's fun. No. My favorite game in the 1980s, you already know what it is. It's Super Mario Bros. The game that basically laid the foundation for the platformer genre as a whole, and was also one of the first video games to ever have music be at the center of a game as a whole. I actually didn't even think about that until I was researching it for this video, but yeah, that's kind of an important thing to note. It's one of the most revolutionary video games ever created, and in my eyes, it still holds up incredibly well. I have a poster here that I will probably take the camera off and show you in a minute, but it's kind of falling off my wall, but I have a poster of World 1-1 on my wall. Here, come take a look. Right there on my wall, a World 1-1 poster. It's kind of falling off, but it's there. And while that poster will probably fall any minute now, and I'll be very sad once it's not on my wall anymore, I'm glad I have the poster because World 1-1 is one of the most iconic video game levels ever created. The way it was crafted to kind of teach player through experience in terms of you learn the game by just playing it was really smart. And I think the level design of Super Mario Bros. As a whole is genius. I mean, Nintendo is pretty well known for creating games with exceptional level design, and that's no exception. The controls are still incredibly tight, and once again, it kind of lands perfectly like some of these other 80s games I've mentioned, where it's simple while also providing plenty of challenge. Even though other games in the franchise have come along and topped the original Super Mario Bros., that doesn't make this any less incredible and iconic. It's still a tight, incredibly crafted game that feels as though it hasn't aged a day. And much like the original Zelda, it's one of those games I feel like everybody should play. Especially if you really do appreciate gaming as a medium and the history of it, and you want to engage with it more than just as a quick little pastime. If you really have an appreciation of gaming, you should absolutely play Super Mario Bros. It's still one of the most incredible games ever created. And even now, after all these years, there are things that it does that still blow my mind. I know I'm a year early, but cheers to this franchise turning 40 next year. That's utterly insane to think about. And to all of you who were born in the 80s, I'm sorry if I just made you feel old. So yeah, those are my favorite games of the 1980s. Again, a pretty small list, but I thought it was important to recognize some historically important games and games that I really love that are much older than myself. As I said, later videos in the series are going to be much longer. It shouldn't be surprising that I, as a 25-year-old, have more experience with modern games than older games. But again, hopefully this helped you guys kind of understand what the rest of the series is going to look like, and hopefully made you excited for the next few videos, because I feel like it's going to get even more fun from here. Again, this list is just my opinion. What are some of your favorite games of the 1980s? What were the games that you played the most, that you loved the most? Some of your earliest games, some of your greatest memories from gaming in the 80s if you were gaming in the 80s. And I know I might be a few years early to asking this question, but I guess in preparation for the next video, since it might get brought up at 1 or 2 points, were you a Nintendo or Sega kid back in the 90s? Back in the 80s, of course, it was the Atari and the NES, but slowly, once the 90s came along, that's when Sega came in, so were you NES and SNES, or were you Genesis? Or maybe even Master System? Whatever your thoughts, opinions, and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal, I totally understand. And yes, next we're going to be getting into the 90s. However, it's not going to be a full-blown I want to talk about the 1990s video because A, there are a lot more 90s games that I want to talk about. Maybe not a crazy amount, but there are more games that came out in the 90s that I want to talk about. And also because the 90s were such a historically significant decade for gaming that I feel like it's best to split the 90s into 2 parts. So the next video I'm going to be doing is going to be my favorite games of 1990 to 1994, and then the video after that will be my favorite games of 1995 to 1999. It shouldn't be too hard to understand why I'm splitting it into 2 parts. Again, if you have any familiarity with what the landscape of gaming was across the 90s, it'll probably make even more sense. Though again, it's also because I have more 90s games to talk about than 80s games, so I think it makes more sense to split it off into 2 videos. Either way, I'm really happy to get started with this series. I'm excited about it. I hope you guys are excited about it too. And until the next episode, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And of course, I will see you in the next video. Peace.